The Elysian ships rained death from above, slaughtering millions, their blood staining the streets crimson, a cruel warning of what happens when you defy an empire. They make you regret it. Humanity never saw it coming. The Evora invasion fleet appeared suddenly in the skies, hailing from the distant Elysian Empire. 7-foot-tall warriors with scaly blue skin and 4 muscular arms, they possessed technology centuries beyond Earth. Their energy cannons and plasma missiles tore through humanity's pitiful defenses like paper. New York, London, Tokyo, all reduced to rubble and ash within hours as the Evora General Yaris led a ruthless extermination campaign. Tens of millions perished in the initial onslaught alone. The survivors huddled in hidden underground bunkers, sewers and subway tunnels. Among them ex-Navy SEAL Paul Robinson, a man with nothing left to lose after the aliens butchered his wife and daughter. Rage simmered in his gut. He would make the Elysian Empire regret ever setting foot on his world. Gathering the remnants of Earth's shattered militaries, a handful of ragtag soldiers and resistance fighters, Robinson and his team prepared to strike back. The odds of success were infinitesimal. The Evora forces outnumbered them 1,000 to 1. Yaris would stop at nothing to crush the last humans into submission and grind their bones to dust. One thing was certain. If the resistance failed in their desperate counterattack, the human race would go extinct, wiped from the cosmos. Earth would fall permanently to Elysian control. Under the cover of night, Paul and his team slipped into the Evora command center through its ventilation system. They crawled through the tight shafts, Paul leading the way, his rifle slung over his back. Sweat poured down his face in the cramped space. They emerged in a dimly lit server room, packed with alien computers and equipment. Paul pulled a data drive from his pocket and jammed it into a terminal, his fingers flying over the holographic keys as he hacked into their systems. "I'm in," he whispered over the radio. "Downloading their files now." Text scrolled across the screen, schematics, reports, supply manifests, and there, buried in the data, was the secret to the Evora's power, Illudium, a rare mineral, mined on a distant world called Zephyrus Prime, the source of their advanced weapons and ships. "That's it," Paul transmitted the files back to base. "If we can take out their Illudium supply, cripple their ability to wage war, then we might actually have a shot at winning this," Sergeant Hawkins finished, a glimmer of hope in his eyes for the first time since the invasion. Paul opened a scrambled comm channel to Admiral Walker. He quickly briefed him on their discovery. "Zephyrus Prime," Walker said thoughtfully. "I can spare a small strike force. Stealth corvettes, elite troops, it's a hell of a risk, but what choice do we have? Get back here and we'll—" Alarms blared through the complex. Evora soldiers poured into the server room, plasma rifles blazing. Paul and his squad dove for cover behind the terminals, returning fire. Molten metal flew everywhere as the room devolved into a close-quarters bloodbath. "They found us. Fall back to the extraction point now," Paul barked. They barely made it out alive, leaving a trail of Evora corpses behind them. As they raced back to their hidden shuttle, Paul's blood ran cold. A menacing figure stepped from the shadows. Zalax, Yaris's personal assassin. The Evora's obsidian armor gleamed in the moonlight, skulls of his victims ornamenting his shoulders. Twin curved blades extended from his wrists. "Leaving so soon, Terran filth?" Zalax snarled. He pounced at inhuman speed. Paul dodged the slashing blades by a hair's breadth. Zalax was fast, strong, a whirlwind of death. Paul fired his rifle until the magazine ran dry. Zalax shrugged off the rounds and lunged. His blade caught Paul across the chest, drawing blood. Hawkins leapt onto the assassin's back, stabbing with a combat knife. Zalax reached back, seized the sergeant with one hand, and hurled him into a wall. Bones cracked. Hawkins fell limp to the ground. With a roar, Paul ripped a plasma grenade from his belt and hurled it. The blast caught Zalax in the chest, sending him reeling back. Paul and the survivors dragged Hawkins into the shuttle. The hatch slammed shut, and they rocketed into the sky as Zalax fired after them in a rage. Paul's hands shook on the controls. They had the information they needed, but the Evora knew they were coming now. The clock was ticking. They had to get to Zephyrus Prime and destroy the Illudium supply. It was their only hope. If they failed, Earth would fall, and humanity would be lost forever. Paul held tight to the shuttle controls as they sliced through the void of space, flanked by Admiral Walker's stealth corvettes. Zephyrus Prime loomed ahead, an emerald jewel against the starry backdrop. This was it. The Illudium mines, the key to the Evora's power. They slipped past the planet's orbital defenses, their ship's cloaking systems masking them from sensors. The shuttle dove into the atmosphere, anti-grav thrusters flaring. Paul guided them down into a narrow canyon, the corvettes landing in formation behind them. The team disembarked into the alien landscape, checking weapons and gear. Towering cliffs of red stone rose on either side, strange vegetation clinging to the rock. In the distance, the massive door to the Illudium mines stood embedded in the canyon wall, blast shielding shimmering around it. "I can breach this," Chen said, attaching a pulsing device to the energy field, "but it'll take a few minutes." The device hummed, the shield flickering. Chen typed furiously at his wrist computer. Sweat beaded his brow. The soldiers fanned out, weapons trained on the entrance. With a crackle, the shield vanished. The massive blast door ground open, revealing a gaping maw into the mines. Dim lights flickered in the depths. The team advanced cautiously, Chen taking point with his scanner. "I'm detecting Illudium signatures," Chen whispered. "It's here, and a lot of it." They made their way deeper, the tunnels twisting and turning. The air grew thick and hot. Strange alien machinery pulsed along the walls. A guttural roar echoed from the darkness ahead. The soldiers froze, raising their weapons. Heavy footsteps approached, the ground shaking. A massive figure emerged from the shadows. Cruel, a hulking Evora warrior, genetically engineered for battle. He stood 9 feet tall, muscles bulging beneath his dark armor, a cannon the size of a small car held in his hands. Cruel fixed his glowing eyes on the humans and let out a bellowing challenge. Evora soldiers poured out behind him, plasma rifles crackling with energy. All hell broke loose. Gunfire and plasma bolts crisscrossed the tunnel. 2 human soldiers went down, seared by sizzling energy. Paul and the team dove for cover behind mining equipment, returning fire. Bullets pinged off Cruel's armor as he advanced, his cannon spitting deadly bolts of plasma. The giant alien was a one-man army, shrugging off attacks and laying waste to the human forces. "Chen," Paul yelled over the chaos, "get those charges planted, we'll hold them off." Chen nodded, grabbing his satchel of explosives and darting off down a side tunnel. Paul and the remaining soldiers poured fire at the Evora, trying to buy time. Krill's cannon stitched a line of destruction across the tunnel. Soldiers screamed as they were cut down. Paul rolled, narrowly avoiding incineration. He snatched up a fallen plasma rifle and fired, the alien weapon bucking in his hands. The bolt struck Cruel in the faceplate, knocking him back a step. The giant roared in fury and charged, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He backhanded a soldier, sending the man flying like a ragdoll to crunch against the wall. Paul unloaded the rifle at point-blank range into Cruel's chest. The armor buckled but held. Cruel seized Paul by the throat with one hand, lifting him off his feet. The alien's fingers tightened, crushing Paul's windpipe. He scrabbled at Cruel's grip, spots dancing in his vision. A plasma grenade soared over Paul's shoulder and latched onto Cruel's helmet. The giant had just enough time to look surprised before the blast shattered his skull and tore his head from his shoulders. Paul dropped to the ground, gasping for breath. Mike stood over him, rifle smoking, a fierce grin on his battle-scarred face. He hauled Paul to his feet. "Still saving your ass," Mike laughed. An Evora plasma bolt took Mike in the side, burning through his armor. He cried out and fell to one knee. More bolts zipped past as the remaining aliens pressed the attack. They found Chen deeper in the mine, frantically wiring charges to the support columns. The doctor's face was pale, blood seeping from a wound in his chest. "I'm hit," Chen gasped, "but the charges are almost set. Just need a few more minutes." "We don't have a few more minutes," Mike shouted. firing blindly back down the tunnel at their pursuers. Paul pulled Chen to his feet, slinging the doctor's arm over his shoulders. They lurched down the tunnel, Mike covering their retreat. Evora soldiers appeared behind them, plasma rifles flashing. Paul shook his head violently. No one gets left behind. He tried to haul Chen onward, but a plasma bolt seared past his face, nearly taking his head off. More Evora poured into the tunnel. There was no time. Chen shoved Paul away. "Go," he cried. "I'll hold them off. Get this done." Anguish tore at Paul, but he knew Chen was right. He had to finish this. For Earth, for humanity. He laid Chen down, squeezing the doctor's shoulder one last time. "Give 'em hell, Doc." Paul and Mike ran, Chen's rifle firing behind them until it abruptly fell silent. They raced through the tunnels, setting the last charges. The ground rumbled, dust shaking from the ceiling. The Evora had breached Chen's position. "Charges set," Paul confirmed. "Let's get the hell out of here." They sprinted for the exit, retracing their steps. A dark figure dropped from the shadows ahead. Zalax. The assassin's blades glinted in the dim light. His skull-adorned armor was slashed and cracked, his face twisted with hate. "You will not leave this place alive," Zalax snarled. Paul squared off against him, combat knife in hand. Mike and the few surviving soldiers took up positions around them, rifles aimed at the tunnel entrances. Zalax lunged, blades flashing. He was a whirlwind of death, faster and stronger than any human. Paul barely parried the slashes, sparks flying from the clashing metal. He ducked and dodged, searching for an opening. The assassin's blades scored a line of fire across Paul's chest, parting his armor like paper. Paul gritted his teeth against the pain and launched a flurry of strikes. Zalax deflected them with contemptuous ease. A plasma bolt sizzled past Paul's ear, striking Zalax in the shoulder. The assassin stumbled back, momentarily off balance. Mike stood with rifle raised, a fierce light in his eyes. Paul seized the opening and lunged, driving his knife toward Zalax's throat. The Evora twisted aside with inhuman speed. His blade took Paul in the leg, sending him sprawling. Zalax loomed over Paul, death in his eyes. He raised his blades for the killing blow. Mike slammed into the assassin, knocking him back. They grappled, Mike's rifle forgotten, Zalax's blades slashing. Paul struggled to rise, his blood slicking the ground. Mike cried out as Zalax ran him through, the curved blades punching out his back in a spray of crimson. With a last burst of strength, Mike pulled a grenade from his belt. "Get clear," Mike shouted. He wrapped himself around Zalax, pulling the assassin close. Paul scrambled back, eyes wide. The grenade detonated. The blast hurled Paul back, ears ringing, vision swimming. Smoke and dust billowed from the crater where Mike and Zalax had stood. Nothing remained of either save shredded flesh and twisted metal. Mike was gone. "Fall back!" Paul roared to the surviving soldiers. Plasma bolts stitched the tunnel around them as more Evora arrived. "Get to the shuttle!" They ran, their numbers dwindling as the aliens picked them off from behind. Only a handful made it back to the landing site. The stealth ships were already spooling up their engines, ramps lowering. Paul stumbled aboard, collapsing into a seat, the last few survivors straggling in behind him. The hatches sealed and the ships lifted off, racing for the stars. Behind them, the ground erupted in a massive fireball as the charges detonated. A chain reaction ripped through the Elysian mines, consuming them in an inferno that blasted out of the canyon in a pillar of fire and smoke. The ships rocked in the shockwave, alarms blaring. Paul watched the destruction on the view screens, his face grim. They had done it, dealt the Evora a crippling blow, but the cost had been high, too high. Chen, Mike, and dozens of brave soldiers had given their lives to make this happen. As Zephyrus Prime fell away behind them, the Elysian mines collapsing into rubble, Paul knew the fight was far from over. They had struck a blow, but the Evora would be enraged. They would lash out, seeking revenge. Earth still hung in the balance, but now at least they had a chance to take the fight to the enemy, to make the Evora bleed. Paul closed his eyes, exhaustion and grief crashing over him. Mike's face swam in his mind, along with all the others lost. He would mourn them later, honor their sacrifice. As Paul and the survivors sped back to Earth, news of their daring strike against the Elysian mines on Zephyrus Prime raced through the human resistance like wildfire. In hidden bunkers, sewers, and ruined buildings across the occupied planet, ragged bands of humans heard of this first real victory against the Evora invaders. A spark of hope flared in their hearts. Maybe the aliens weren't invincible after all. Resistance fighters salvaged Evora plasma rifles and power armor from the burnt-out husks of crashed dropships. They pried data drives from the shattered skulls of Evora warriors and hacked into their comm networks. Guerrilla teams struck in the night, lighting up Evora supply depots in the radioactive glow of plasma bombs, ambushing Evora patrols in the rubble-choked streets with jury-rigged mines and concentrated rifle fire. One resistance cell, a hardcore group of ex-Marines and Spec Ops led by Jack Reeves, hit the aliens hard and fast. They'd stripped the plasma coils from downed Evora fighters, rigging up a devastating cannon. Reeves and his soldiers crept through the ruins of Denver to the enemy's main supply hub, a heavily guarded depot stockpiled with the weapons and equipment needed to subjugate Earth. Reeves peered through his rifle scope, sighting in on the Evora guards. Their bone armor fused to scaly flesh, their forearms cradling plasma rifles. He flashed a hand signal. His fighters fanned out through the rubble, moving into position. The raiders struck as one, the plasma cannon flaring to life, searing through the depot's blast doors in a blinding flash. Return fire sizzled back, scorching the rubble. Reeves' team poured through the breach, rifles bucking. Evora warriors fell in sprays of blood and bone. Bullets and plasma bolts crisscrossed the depot. Reeves tackled an Evora trooper, smashing the butt of his rifle into the alien's face until it caved in with a sickly crunch. "Charges set," Reeves barked into his comm. 60 seconds. They raced out as fast as they'd struck, plasma sizzling at their heels. The charges detonated in a massive fireball that lit the night sky orange and hurled the twisted wreckage of alien tanks and artillery for miles. At his underground command post, Yaris studied the holographic displays with a scowl. Reports of human attacks streaming in. The loss of the Elysium had been a blow, but not a fatal one. The humans swarmed like vermin, scurrying from their holes to nip at the edges of his forces. These raids were pinpricks, an annoyance, but he couldn't let this rebellion spread, let the humans start to believe they had a chance. It was time to burn out this infection at its source. "Deploy the Scourge," Yaris ordered, his voice a razor-edged growl. The Evora Scourge, nanite swarms, billions of microscopic machines that stripped flesh from bone, an all-consuming fog of death. A hive of transport ships rose from the ruins of Cape Canaveral, the former heart of human spaceflight, reduced to a launch pad for alien horrors. The ships tore through the ashen skies, bearing their lethal cargo towards the Rocky Mountains, the last stronghold of free humanity. Reeves and his rebels had made their base in the winding caves and narrow passes, stockpiles of weapons and supplies hidden deep in the mountain's heart. Yaris's ships hovered over the snow-capped peaks, the rocky valleys where human refugees huddled in ramshackle camps. Hatches yawned open, and clouds of glittering black poured out in an endless swarm, sweeping down into the passes, an onrushing tide of destruction. Reeves sounded the alarm, a wailing klaxon cutting through the thin mountain air. His men rushed to their posts, manning gun turrets and anti-aircraft batteries ripped from fallen Evora vessels. They threw up hasty barricades of stone and steel at the cave mouths, shored up the defenses. And then the Scourge was upon them, an all-consuming wave crashing down from the heavens. It scoured over the human camps, tearing through flesh and bone in seconds, leaving nothing but gory smears in its wake. Reeves's men opened fire, flinging plasma and bullets into the chittering swarm. Bolts of energy crackled from the defense batteries, the white-hot beams turning patches of the nanites to molten slag. But it wasn't enough. The Scourge kept coming, an endless tide pouring through the valleys, sweeping up the slopes. It struck the rebel defenses, clawing through steel and stone like paper. Reeves watched in horror as it surged over his barricades, swarming his men. Their screams cut short as the nanites bored through armor and flesh in sprays of blood, stripping them to skeletons in moments. Soldiers and refugees fled deeper into the mountains, chased by the implacable swarm. Reeves and a handful of diehards fought a desperate rearguard action, plasma rifles flaring as they traded their lives to buy the others time. Reeves felt the scourge clawing at his armor, the nanites worming through the joints, searing into flesh. He gritted his teeth against the agony and kept firing until his rifle hissed empty. And then he ran, his skin flaying from his body as the scourge ate him alive. The cold mountain air scoured his raw nerves like salt in a wound as he fled deeper into the caves, chasing the echoes of screams in the dark. Behind him, the scourge stripped the caves clean, melting through rock and earth in a glittering black wave. Thousands of humans perished in the mountains that day, the last free stronghold falling to Yaris's horrific weapon. Only a handful of survivors escaped through the far passes, fleeing out into the blasted wasteland of the Evora occupation. Reeves was among them, his face a skull-like mask of seared meat, the nanites fused to his bones. He would carry the scars of that day forever. On the Elpis, Paul and the remnants of his strike team limped into the hidden hangar bay, their battered shuttle settling to the deck. Admiral Walker met them as the ramp lowered, medics rushing to aid the wounded. Paul stumbled down the ramp, clutching his bleeding side. His face was a mask of soot and blood, his eyes haunted. Walker gripped his shoulder as the medics swarmed him. "You did it," Walker said. "You struck a blow they won't soon forget." Walker bowed his head. "Their sacrifice will be remembered. When we win this war, their names will be spoken with reverence." He followed the medics to the infirmary, barely noticing as they stitched his wounds and set his broken bones. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams haunted by the faces of the fallen. When he woke, Admiral Walker was at his bedside, his face grim. "The Evora struck back," Walker said. "Some kind of nanotech weapon. It hit the Rocky Mountains, wiped out the resistance there. Thousands dead." Paul struggled to sit up, his chest burning. "Reeves, the civilians?" "Only a handful made it out. The Evora, they're getting desperate, striking harder. We need a new plan, a way to end this once and for all." Paul nodded, his eyes hardening. "Dr. Chen's daughter," he said. "Lisa. Mike said she was working on something, a secret project. We need to find her." Walker straightened, his jaw set. "I'll put out the word, send a team to bring her in. In the meantime, rest up. Heal. We'll need you for this fight." Paul leaned back, his eyes drifting shut. The Evora had taken everything from him, his family, his world, his friends, but he wouldn't stop fighting, not until his last breath. Chen and Mike's sacrifices had to mean something. He would have his revenge, even if it killed him. On the far side of the planet, in the ruins of what had once been Hong Kong, Dr. Lisa Chen worked feverishly in her makeshift lab, cobbled together from scavenged Evora tech and salvaged equipment. Her father's last transmission played on a loop, his voice crackling with static. "Lisa, the Illudium was the key, but there's something more. The nanites, a weakness in their coding. You can use it against them. Turn their weapons back on them. It's up to you now. You're our last hope." Lisa paused the recording, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She turned back to her work, fingers flying over the holographic displays. Lines of alien code scrolled across the screens, the secrets of the Evora nanites laid bare before her. Her father had given his life for this. She wouldn't let him down, she wouldn't let the Evora win. No matter what it took, she would find a way to end this war. Paul stood in the dimly lit cargo hold of the stolen Evora supply ship, surrounded by a hand-picked team of the Resistance's finest. Jack Reeves and his former Marines checked their weapons, the polished Evora plasma rifles gleaming under the harsh industrial lights. Dr. Lisa Chen tapped at a holographic display, her brow furrowed in concentration as she made final adjustments to the cloaking devices. "All right, listen up," Paul barked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "We've got one shot at this, one chance to end this war. The Evora command ship is heavily guarded, but with these disguises, we should be able to slip right past their defenses." Paul nodded, slipping into his own disguise. The alien armor felt strange against his skin, the eyepieces of the helmet glowing an eerie red. "Dr. Chen," he called out, "how's that cloaking tech coming?" Lisa looked up from her work, a fierce determination burning in her eyes. "It's ready," she said, her voice steady. "Once I activate it, we'll be virtually invisible to their sensors. But it won't last long. We'll have to move fast." Paul gave a curt nod. "You heard the lady. Gear up and get ready to move." The team scrambled to don their disguises, checking weapons and equipment with practiced efficiency. The cargo hold thrummed with barely contained energy, the anticipation of the coming battle palpable in the recycled air. A proximity alarm blared, red light pulsing through the hold. "We're approaching the command ship," Lisa reported, her fingers flying over the controls. "Activating cloak now." The ship shuddered as the cloaking field engaged, the hull rippling like a mirage. For a moment Paul's heart pounded in his chest, the fear that the cloak might fail, that they might be discovered, threatening to overwhelm him. But the ship slipped past the command vessel's defenses without challenge, gliding through the void like a ghost. Paul let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "We're in," he said, his voice tight with tension. "Prep for docking." The ship shuddered as it slid into the command vessel's docking bay, the airlock hissing open. Paul and his team stepped out into the cavernous hangar, their disguises blending seamlessly with the Evora crew. They moved with purpose, the stolen armor masking their human features, the holographic overlays that Lisa had designed, making them virtually indistinguishable from the real thing. They made their way through the twisting corridors of the ship, following the schematics that Lisa had pulled from the Evora databanks. The command ship was a labyrinth of gleaming metal and pulsing conduits, a far cry from the ruined cities and blasted wastelands of Earth. As they approached the central computer core, Paul's comm crackled to life. Admiral Walker's voice, thin and strained, filtered through the static. Paul tapped his earpiece, his heart racing. "I read you, Admiral. We're on the command ship making our way to the computer core. What's your status?" "We've engaged the Evora ground forces," Walker replied, the sound of explosions and gunfire echoing in the background. "We're hitting them with everything we've got, trying to draw their attention away from you, but we can't hold out for long. You need to move fast." Paul's jaw clenched, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Understood, Admiral. We'll get it done. Just hold on a little longer." The comm went dead, leaving only static in its wake. Paul turned to his team, his eyes hard behind the alien helmet. "You heard the man. We're on the clock. Let's move." They pushed forward, their pace quickening as they neared their objective. The computer core loomed ahead, a massive sphere of pulsing light and swirling data streams. But as they approached the entrance, alarms began to blare throughout the ship. The team froze, weapons snapping up, as Evora soldiers poured into the corridor, plasma rifles leveled at their heads. And at their head, a figure that sent a chill down Paul's spine. Yaris, the Evora commander, his eyes blazing with hatred and rage. "Did you really think your pathetic disguises would fool me?" Yaris snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "I've been waiting for you, human filth, waiting for a chance to crush you myself." "Take cover," he yelled, diving behind a bulkhead as plasma bolts sizzled through the air. His team scattered, finding what little cover they could in the exposed corridor. Bullets and plasma streaked back and forth, the air filling with the stench of ozone and burnt metal. Paul popped up from cover, his rifle bucking in his hands as he sent a burst of fire towards the Evora line. A soldier went down, his chest a smoking ruin. But more took his place, a seemingly endless wave of scaly flesh and gleaming armor. Beside him, Jack Reeves unleashed a barrage of plasma bolts, his face a mask of grim determination. But even as he cut down Evora warriors, Paul could see the toll it was taking. Blood streamed from a wound in Jack's side, his armor scorched and pitted. Paul gritted his teeth, desperation clawing at his gut. They were so close, the computer core was just ahead, if they could just punch through. But the Evora kept coming, heedless of their losses. For every one that fell, two more seemed to take their place. Paul's team was being whittled down, cut apart by the relentless onslaught. He saw Lisa go down, a plasma bolt taking her in the leg. She screamed, her hand scrabbling for her fallen rifle. Paul lunged towards her, desperate to pull her to safety. But Jack was there first, throwing himself over her prone form as a hail of plasma fire raked the corridor. He shuddered as the bolts slammed into his back, his armor smoking and sizzling. "Get her out of here," Jack roared, his voice thick with pain. "I'll hold them off." Paul hesitated, torn between the mission and his fallen friend. But the look in Jack's eyes brooked no argument. "Go," Jack yelled, surging to his feet, his rifle spitting fire. "Finish this." Paul nodded, his heart heavy. He scooped up Lisa, slinging her over his shoulder as he made a break for the computer core. Behind him, he heard Jack's defiant roar, the staccato bark of his rifle as he bought them precious seconds with his life. The sounds of battle faded as Paul and the surviving members of his team stumbled into the computer chamber, the massive data core looming before them. Lisa slid from Paul's shoulder, her face pale, her hands shaking as she pulled the data drive from her pocket. "Cover me," she rasped, limping towards the central terminal. "This won't take long." Paul and the others formed a perimeter, rifles trained on the entrance, ready for the Evora to come pouring through at any moment. The seconds crawled by, each one an eternity, as Lisa worked feverishly at the terminal. The sound of gunfire and plasma blasts echoed from the corridor outside, drawing closer with each passing heartbeat. Paul's finger tightened on the trigger, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "How much longer?" he called over his shoulder, desperation creeping into his voice. "Almost there," Lisa replied, her voice strained. "Just a few more seconds." The door to the chamber exploded inward, Evora soldiers pouring through the smoking ruin. Plasma bolts filled the air, sizzling past Paul's head as he opened fire. His team unleashed a hail of bullets, the deafening roar of gunfire mixing with the alien snarls of the Evora. But even as they cut down the first wave, more flooded in behind them, a tide of armored bodies and flashing blades. Paul saw his team falling one by one, plasma bolts finding gaps in armor, blades cleaving through flesh and bone. He fell back step by step, his rifle growing hot in his hands as he fired non-stop into the press of alien bodies. The stench of blood and burnt metal filled his nostrils, the screams of the dying and the roar of gunfire pounding in his ears. And then, through the chaos and the smoke, a figure emerged. Yaris, his armor splattered with human blood, his eyes alight with a cruel hunger. He raised his plasma rifle, aiming it squarely at Paul's chest. "Now you die human," Yaris snarled, "and your pathetic resistance dies with you." Paul tensed, ready to dodge, to fire back, to go down fighting. But before Yaris could pull the trigger, an alarm blared through the chamber. The lights flickered, the data screens flashing with strange symbols and cascading code. Yaris hesitated, confusion flickering across his alien features. He turned towards the central terminal where Lisa slumped over the controls, a triumphant smile on her blood-flecked lips. "Got you, you bastard!" she rasped. Yaris loomed over Paul, his exosuit whirring with power, the barrel of his energy cannon glowing hot as he leveled it at Paul's face. Paul rolled to the side, barely avoiding the searing beam that scorched the deck, where he'd been a heartbeat before. He came up firing, his plasma rifle spitting bolts at the Evora general. But Yaris's armor shrugged off the shots like rain, the advanced alloys absorbing the energy with ease. He lunged forward with inhuman speed, a blade of crackling energy extending from his gauntlet. Paul parried desperately, the force of the blow sending shocks up his arm. They traded blows across the command deck, the air humming with the clash of energy weapons. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks as stray shots struck home. Behind them, Dr. Chen worked frantically at the central terminal, her fingers flying over the controls as she uploaded the virus. The progress bar crawled across the screen with agonizing slowness. "Hurry!" Paul yelled, ducking under a sweeping cut that would have taken his head. He raked his blade across Yaris's midsection, searching for a weak point, but the general's armor held firm. Yaris pressed the attack, forcing Paul back with a flurry of slashes and stabs. His energy cannon spat searing beams, the heat blistering even through Paul's armor. Paul gritted his teeth against the pain, retaliating with a barrage of plasma bolts. The deck shuddered as an explosion rocked the ship. Warning alarms blared, red lights pulsing. The computer core was taking heavy damage, screens flickering and dying, conduits bursting in gouts of flame. Dr. Chen cursed, sweat beading her brow as she worked. "The system's fail-safes are kicking in," she shouted over the chaos. "They're trying to stop the upload." Dr. Chen typed furiously, her hands a blur. "I can override it," she said, her voice strained, "but I'll have to stay here, manually input the commands. You need to go, now." Paul shook his head violently, even as he barely deflected a slash that would have opened him from shoulder to hip. "No, we're not leaving you." "You have to." Dr. Chen met his eyes, fierce determination burning in her gaze. "It's the only way I can do this, Paul, for my father, for Earth. You have to go. Finish this." Anguish tore at Paul's heart. She was right. He knew she was right. But the thought of leaving her behind, of abandoning yet another friend... Yaris sensed his distraction, pressing the attack with renewed fury. His blade carved through Paul's armor, drawing a line of fire across his ribs. Paul stumbled back, his rifle falling from numb fingers. Yaris raised his cannon, the barrel glowing like a hellish eye. Paul tensed, preparing for the final blow. Behind him, Dr. Chen stood at the terminal, a fierce grin on her face as the progress bar flashed 100%. "Burn, you bastard!" she snarled. The virus raced through the Evora systems, rewriting code, corrupting data. The nanites, once the Evora's greatest weapon, turned on their masters, attacking Evora biology with ruthless efficiency. Yaris convulsed, his armor shattering like glass. He fell to his knees, ichor spilling from his eyes, his mouth, the rents in his crumbling exosuit. With a final gurgling cry, he collapsed, his body dissolving into a puddle of foul liquid as the nanites consumed him from within. Klaxons shrieked, the deck shuddering underfoot. Red warning lights flashed on every console. "The ship's systems are failing," Dr. Chen called out. "The virus is spreading. You need to get out of here." Paul staggered to his feet, his heart heavy. He knew what she was going to say before she said it. "I have to stay," Dr. Chen said, her voice calm despite the chaos. "I have to make sure the virus takes hold, that it spreads to the rest of the fleet. This is the only way to be sure." Paul opened his mouth to argue, but the words died on his lips, the determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. She had made her choice, and he had to respect it, no matter how much it tore him apart. She shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "Go," she said softly. "Save our people, save our world, and remember me." Tears stung Paul's eyes. He reached out, clasping her hand one last time. "I will," he promised, "always." Then he turned and ran, his heart breaking with every step. Behind him, the command ship shuddered and groaned, the virus eating it from the inside out. Conduits burst, consoles exploded, the very air seeming to shimmer with the nanite's destructive power. Paul raced through the disintegrating corridors, dodging falling debris and gouts of flame. The surviving members of his team fell in behind him, their faces grim, their eyes haunted by the sacrifice they were leaving behind. They burst into the hangar bay, the battered remnants of their hijacked supply ship waiting for them. Evora soldiers lay strewn across the deck, their bodies twisted and broken, the virus having already done its grim work. Paul and his team scrambled aboard, sealing the hatch behind them. He flung himself into the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the controls. The ship lurched and shuddered as he punched the engines to full, blasting out of the hangar into the chaos of the space battle raging outside. Evora ships drifted dead in space, their hulls pitted and scarred, the virus spreading like a plague through their systems, escape pods and shuttles frantically launched from the stricken vessels, the crews desperate to flee the nanite swarm consuming their ships. Paul wove through the debris field, his heart pounding in his ears. Behind them, the command ship shuddered and convulsed, explosions rippling across its hull, and then, with a final titanic blast, it shattered, consumed from within by Dr. Chen's sacrifice. Tears streamed down Paul's face as he watched the fireball bloom in the viewport, a silent tribute to the woman who had given everything to save her world. He knew her loss would haunt him forever, another scar on his battered soul. But she had bought them a chance, a sliver of hope. The Evora fleet lay in ruins, their greatest weapon turned against them. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since the invasion began, Paul dared to believe they might just win this war. He set a course for Earth, to regroup, to recover, to plan for the battles still to come. And as the stars streaked past the viewport, he made a silent vow to the fallen, to Chen and Mike, and all the others who had given their lives in this desperate fight. He would see this through to the end, for them, for Earth, for the future they had dreamed of, the future they had died for. No matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice, he would keep fighting. Until the Evora were nothing more than a bitter memory, until humanity was free once more. As the virus spread through the Evora fleet, their ships shuddered and convulsed, crashing from orbit in streaks of fire. The alien vessels ploughed into the ruins of conquered cities, leveling entire blocks in thunderous impacts that shook the Earth. Admiral Walker wasted no time seizing the opportunity. He rallied the resistance forces, arming them with plasma rifles and power armor stripped from fallen Evora warriors. The humans surged out from their hidden bunkers and bolt holes, ready to take back their world. In the shattered remains of Los Angeles, Paul led a strike team in a fierce assault on an Evora strongpoint. Plasma bolts crisscrossed the rubble-strewn streets as human and Evora forces clashed. Paul ducked behind the burnt-out husk of a car, his rifle bucking in his hands as he fired at the alien positions. "Push forward," he barked into his comm. "We've got them on the run." His team advanced, leapfrogging from cover to cover. They stormed the Evora bunker, plasma grenades blasting smoking holes in the reinforced walls. The aliens fell back, their lines crumbling. But the Evora would not go down easily. From the ashes of defeat, a new leader emerged, General Zaxos, a ruthless strategist known for his brutal tactics. Zaxos rallied the Evora forces, ordering a scorched earth campaign. If they could not hold a human settlement, they would destroy it utterly, leaving nothing but ash and bones. Evora kill teams razed farms and factories, poisoned water supplies, detonated power plants in mushroom clouds of radioactive fire. They would leave Earth a lifeless husk before they let the humans reclaim it. To make matters worse, Zaxos deployed a terrifying new weapon, the behemoths. Towering monstrosities of flesh and metal, these genetically engineered horrors stood over 10 feet tall, their bodies bulging with grotesque musculature. They shrugged off plasma bolts and bullets, wading through human forces like a scythe through wheat. In the bombed-out ruins of Chicago, Paul's team fought a desperate battle against a squad of behemoths. The giants tore through the human lines, crushing soldiers underfoot, ripping men in half with their bare hands. Paul unloaded his rifle into a charging behemoth, the plasma bolts sizzling against its armored hide. The beast roared in fury and backhanded him across the street. He slammed into a wall, his vision flashing red with pain. His team fell back, trying to regroup, but the behemoths pushed forward implacably. Plasma grenades and rockets exploded against them to little effect. A scream over the comm. Sergeant Hawkins torn limb from limb. Private Mendez crushed beneath a massive foot. The behemoths left a trail of broken, mangled bodies in their wake. Paul staggered to his feet, his head ringing, his armor battered and scorched. He rallied the survivors, leading them in a fighting retreat through the ruins. They ducked and weaved through shattered buildings, the behemoths smashing through walls in pursuit. They had to buy time for the civilians to evacuate. A group of survivors were holed up in a nearby subway station, terrified men, women, and children. Paul and his team had to hold the line, no matter the cost. They made their stand at a choke point, a narrow alley hemmed in by high walls. The behemoths charged straight into the kill zone, bellowing in rage. Paul and his soldiers poured fire into the monsters, plasma bolts and grenades flashing in the confined space. One behemoth went down, its skull shattered by a lucky shot, but the others kept coming, shrugging off the barrage. They smashed into the human lines like a tidal wave. Men screamed and died, crushed and broken. Paul fought with desperate fury, his rifle blazing, his combat knife flashing. A massive hand seized him, lifted him high. He stared into the behemoth's pitiless eyes, its lipless mouth stretched in a snarl. It squeezed, armored fingers denting his chest plate, driving the breath from his lungs. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision. Distantly he heard the screams of his dying soldiers. The beast's grip tightened, his ribs cracked, he couldn't breathe. A plasma bolt struck the behemoth in the face, shattering its jaw. It reeled back, dropping Paul to the ground. He landed hard, agony lancing through his chest. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was a battered APC roaring into the alley. Admiral Walker leaning out the hatch, a smoking plasma rifle in his hands. Then the world went black. Paul swam up from unconsciousness slowly, his body a dull ache of pain. He blinked, taking in his surroundings. A makeshift medical bay, cots lined up in rows, the moans of the wounded filling the air. Admiral Walker sat at his bedside, his face lined with exhaustion and grief. Walker's silence was answer enough. Paul closed his eyes, grief and rage warring in his heart. The behemoths tore through our defenses like tissue paper, Walker continued grimly. We're losing more ground every day. The Evora have us on the ropes. Zaxos is pushing us to the brink. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. We need a new strategy, Paul, some way to even the odds, or this war will be over soon, and we won't be the victors. Paul nodded, a cold determination settling over him. He would find a way. He had to, for his fallen soldiers, for Lisa Chen, for all the innocent lives snuffed out by Evora cruelty. No matter the cost, no matter how long it took, he would see Earth free, or he would die trying. Pain racked Paul's body as he lay in the medical bay, the faces of his fallen comrades flashing through his mind. Sergeant Hawkins torn limb from limb, Private Mendez crushed beneath a behemoth's foot. The losses weighed on him, a burden he carried with every breath. But he couldn't give up. Not now, not when they were so close to breaking the Evora's hold on Earth. He had to find a way to strike back, to make Zaxos and his behemoths pay for every human life they'd stolen. The medbay door hissed open, and a figure stepped inside. Talos, the former Evora scientist who'd defected to the human resistance. His scaled skin was pale, his eyes haunted by the things he'd seen, the atrocities he'd been party to under Zaxos' command. I have information, Talos said, his voice a rasping whisper, about Zaxos' plans, his secret weapon. Talos leaned close, his voice urgent. Zaxos has a research facility, hidden deep in the Amazon rainforest. He and his top scientists are developing a new breed of bioweapon there, something called the Leviathan. A monster, Talos said grimly, genetically engineered, bred for one purpose, to wipe out humanity. Zaxos plans to unleash it on the resistance, to scour the Earth clean of human life once and for all. Paul clenched his fists, rage and determination burning in his gut. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. Where is this facility? He demanded. How do we get inside? Talos produced a data chip from his pocket, pressed it into Paul's hand. Everything you need is here, but you must act quickly. The Leviathan is nearing completion. If Zaxos unleashes it... It was a desperate gambit, infiltrating a fortified Evora compound deep in hostile territory. But they had no choice. The fate of the human race hung in the balance. They struck at dawn, the jungle mists still clinging to the trees. Paul and his team moved like ghosts through the undergrowth, Talos guiding them towards a hidden access tunnel. Olivia worked her magic on the security systems, looping camera feeds and disabling alarms to mask their approach. At the tunnel mouth, a pair of Evora guards stood sentry, plasma rifles cradled in their forearms. Alex's sniper rifle coughed twice, and the guards crumpled, ichor spraying the ferrocrete walls. Paul and the others slipped inside, following the twisting passageways deep into the earth. The air grew hot and close, the tunnels lit by pulsing bioluminescent fungi. A hulking form loomed out of the shadows ahead, a behemoth, its massive frame blocking the passage. Sam unslung a plasma mine from his pack, armed it with a tap of a button. "Fire in the hole," he growled. The mine adhered to the behemoth's armored chest and detonated in a searing flash. The creature roared, staggering back, its carapace cracked and smoking. Paul and the others opened fire, plasma bolts stitching across the behemoth's body until it toppled, its massive corpse filling the tunnel. They pushed on, fighting their way through security drones and Evora soldiers, following Talos's schematics to the heart of the facility. At last they reached the central chamber, a cavernous space dominated by an immense incubation tank. And floating in that tank, suspended in glowing green fluid, was the Leviathan. It was a nightmare-given flesh, a massive serpentine horror bristling with claws and fanged maws. Its eyes, not yet open, were each the size of a human torso. "My God," Olivia breathed, "it's an abomination." "And it's the Evora's key to victory," Paul said grimly. "We have to destroy it now." Sam knelt by the incubation tank, placing shaped charges at key structural points. The others took up defensive positions around the chamber, scanning for threats. They all knew that the explosion would be like a beacon, drawing every Evora soldier in the facility down on their heads. "Charges set," Sam reported, stepping back from the tank. "Ready to detonate on your—" A blade of searing plasma flashed out of the shadows and impaled Sam through the chest. He gasped, eyes wide with shock, as he slid off the glowing sword and crumpled to the floor. And out of the darkness strode General Zaxos himself, his bone-white armor glinting in the bioluminescent light, his skull-like face twisted in a cruel smile as he raised his plasma blade, the air shimmering around its edge. "You really thought you could destroy my creation so easily," he hissed. "You underestimate me, human filth, and now you will pay the price for your arrogance." He lunged at Paul, moving with inhuman speed. Paul barely got his rifle up in time to block the blow, the plasma blade sizzling against the gun's barrel. He kicked out, knocking Zaxos back a step, and opened fire at point-blank range. But Zaxos was a blur of motion, his blade flashing as he deflected the plasma bolts with contemptuous ease. He pressed the attack, driving Paul back with a flurry of slashes and stabs. Sparks flew as their weapons clashed again and again. Behind them, Alex and Olivia poured fire at the Evora general, but he shrugged off the bolts like raindrops. His armor seemed impervious to their weapons, a shimmering second skin that no plasma could pierce. Paul felt a searing line of pain across his chest as Zaxos's blade slipped through his guard, parting armor and flesh. He stumbled back, blood soaking his uniform. Zaxos pressed the advantage, hammering at Paul's weakening defenses, a cruel smile on his alien face. And then Talos was there, throwing himself at Zaxos with a desperate cry. The former scientist grappled with the general, four arms straining against Zaxos's inhuman strength. Talos locked eyes with Paul over Zaxos's shoulder, a look of grim determination on his face. Zaxos roared in fury and ran Talos through, his plasma blade bursting from the scientist's back in a spray of ichor. But Talos held on with the strength of the dying, buying Paul a precious few seconds. Paul staggered to the incubation tank, his blood slicking the ferrocrete floor. With shaking fingers he primed the detonator Sam had set, watching the countdown flicker to life on the small screen. Zaxos hurled Talos's lifeless body aside and charged at Paul, murder in his eyes. But it was too late. Paul slammed his fist down on the detonator, and the world went white. Paul dragged himself to his feet, ears ringing, vision swimming. His team staggered from the rubble, battered and bloody but alive. They gathered around him, staring at the burning ruin of the Leviathan and the groaning form of Zaxos. But even as she spoke, alarms began to blare throughout the facility. The explosion had triggered every security system, every defense protocol. They could hear the pounding of heavy footsteps, the snarls of behemoths, and the shouts of Evora soldiers. They were surrounded, trapped in the ruins of the facility with no escape. Zaxos stirred, rising unsteadily to his feet, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You've accomplished nothing," he snarled, "except to seal your own doom. My forces will tear you apart, and then we will build another Leviathan, and another, until your pathetic species is nothing but ash and memory." Paul raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at Zaxos' skull-like face. "Not if we take you down first," he growled. The Evora closed in, a tide of armored bodies and flashing blades. Paul and his team formed a circle, weapons leveled, prepared to fight to their last breath. They had struck a blow against the Evora, but the war was far from over. As the first plasma bolts sizzled overhead and the roars of the behemoths filled the air, Paul knew that this was only the beginning of the fight for Earth's survival, and he would not stop until every last Evora invader was driven from his world, or until he lay dead at their feet. There was no other choice. For humanity, for vengeance, for the future, he would fight on. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air as Paul and his battered team crouched behind the rubble, returning fire at the advancing Evora troops. Olivia cried out as a bolt grazed her arm, the stench of burnt flesh filling the air. "We can't hold them off much longer," Sam yelled over the din of battle, slamming a fresh power cell into his rifle. Paul gritted his teeth, desperation clawing at his gut. They were out of options, out of time. The Evora closed in, their armor glinting in the dim light of the ruined facility. Just as all seemed lost, a massive explosion rocked the chamber. The walls buckled and cracked, dust raining down from the ceiling. Through the haze, Paul saw a group of heavily armed soldiers burst into the room, plasma rifles blazing. At their head was a familiar figure in battle-scarred armor, Admiral Walker, his face grim, his eyes hard. He barked orders to his men as they fanned out, engaging the Evora in close-quarters combat. Paul and his team surged to their feet, joining the fray. They fought side by side with Walker's soldiers, plasma bolts and bullets filling the air. Evora warriors fell, their armor scorched and shattered. They fought their way through the twisting corridors of the facility, stepping over the bodies of the fallen. Alarms blared, emergency lights flashing red. The ground shook beneath their feet as distant explosions rocked the complex. As they burst out into the open air, Paul staggered to a halt, his eyes widening. The landscape had been transformed into a hellish wasteland, the ground cracked and broken. Massive sinkholes yawned open, swallowing entire Evora battalions. Tanks and artillery pieces vanished into the earth, their crews screaming. It was the aftermath of the Leviathan's destruction, the facility's underground chambers collapsing in on themselves. The Evora forces were in disarray, scattered and leaderless. "To the dropship now!" Walker yelled, waving them forward. They ran, leaping over gaping chasms, dodging falling debris. Plasma bolts sizzled past them as the remaining Evora troops gave chase. At last, they reached the waiting dropship, its engines roaring. They scrambled aboard, collapsing onto the deck as the hatch slammed shut behind them. The ship lifted off, rising up through the smoke and dust. Paul slumped against the bulkhead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked around at his team, battered and bloodied, but alive. They had made it, against all odds. The dropship tore through the ashen skies, leaving the ruined facility behind. It flew for hours, skimming low over the blasted landscape. Finally, it descended towards a hidden valley, a series of camouflaged hangars and bunkers built into the mountainside. They disembarked, striding into the secret base. It was a hive of activity, soldiers and technicians rushing to and fro. Paul saw faces he recognized, resistance leaders from all over the world. In the command center, a familiar figure turned to greet them. Dr. Mei Chen, Lisa's sister, her face lined with grief, but her eyes blazing with determination. "Paul?" she said, clasping his hand. "I heard about Lisa. I'm so sorry." Paul swallowed hard, pushing down the surge of emotion. She gave her life to save us all, to give us a fighting chance. May nodded, her jaw tight. "And we won't let her sacrifice be in vain. With the Leviathan destroyed, the Evora chain of command is in chaos. Different factions are fighting for control." "It's not over yet," Admiral Walker said grimly. He tapped a series of commands into the central holotable, bringing up a flickering image. Paul leaned in, his blood running cold. It was a massive Evora dreadnought bristling with weapons, and in its hold a pulsing, glowing device that made his skin crawl just to look at it. "Then we have to stop them," Paul said, his voice hard, "whatever it takes." Round the table the resistance leaders nodded, their faces grim. They knew the stakes, knew this was their last chance. Failure was not an option. The fate of the entire human race hung in the balance. As Paul looked around at his fellow survivors, he saw the same determination burning in their eyes. They had come too far, lost too much to give up now. One way or another, this war would end, and they would be the ones to end it. Paul gripped the controls of the captured Evora shuttle, his knuckles white beneath his battle-scarred gloves. Beside him, Admiral Walker's face was set in a mask of grim determination. Dr. May Chen, her eyes still red from the tears she'd shed for her fallen sister, hunched over a holographic display, monitoring the dreadnought's defenses. The shuttle shuddered as it sliced through the void, the dreadnought looming ahead like a monstrous shadow against the stars. Paul's heart hammered in his chest as they drew closer, the shuttle's cloaking field barely concealing their approach. "Docking bay ahead," May said, her voice tight. "Security codes transmitted, we're in." The shuttle slipped past the dreadnought's energy shields and settled onto the deck with a metallic clang. Paul and his team moved quickly, checking weapons and gear. The hatch hissed open, revealing a cavernous hangar bay swarming with Evora soldiers and security drones. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air as the team charged down the ramp, rifles spitting fire. Paul ducked and weaved through the chaos, his rifle bucking in his hands. Evora warriors fell, their armor smoking and sparking. Drones exploded in showers of molten metal. They fought their way deeper into the ship, following the schematics May had pulled from the Evora databanks. The corridors were a labyrinth of pulsing conduits and humming machinery, the air thick with the stench of ozone. A blast door loomed ahead, heavily reinforced. May rushed forward, attaching a hacking device to the control panel. The device beeped and whirred, the door grinding open with a hiss of hydraulics. And there, suspended in a vast chamber of crackling energy fields and pulsing biotech, was the Doomsday device. It was a nightmare made flesh, a writhing mass of tentacles and pulsing flesh, its maw bristling with jagged teeth. May's face paled as she scanned the readouts on her display. It's alive, a living weapon bred for destruction on an unimaginable scale. Paul swallowed hard, fighting down a surge of revulsion. They had to end this here and now. He unslung the antimatter bomb from his back, preparing to arm it. But before he could take a step, a figure emerged from the shadows. A towering Evora warrior, his body a fusion of flesh and metal, his eyes glowing with baleful light. General Zarax, the last of the Evora's military leaders. "You've come far, humans," Zarax rasped, his voice a metallic snarl. "But this is where your pathetic resistance ends." He lunged forward, a blade of crackling energy extending from his cybernetic arm. Paul met his charge, his rifle abandoned, a power sword leaping to life in his hands. They clashed in a blaze of sparks and flashing energy, their blades humming and spitting. Zarax was fast, inhumanly strong, his movements a blur of speed and precision. Around them, Paul's team fought desperately against the tide of Evora reinforcements pouring into the chamber. Plasma bolts and explosions filled the air, the deck shuddering underfoot. Paul's vision tunneled, his focus narrowing to the snarling face of Zarax. He pressed the attack, his blade flashing, driving the general back step by step. But Zarax was relentless, shrugging off blows that would have felled a lesser warrior. His blade slipped past Paul's guard, slicing across his ribs, his thigh. Paul stumbled, blood pooling at his feet. With a roar of triumph, Zarax lunged, his blade aimed at Paul's heart. Time seemed to slow, the general's face twisted in a rictus of hate. Paul acted on instinct, dropping his blade, his hands closing around the antimatter bomb at his belt. He armed it with a flick of his thumb and hurled it at Zarax's feet. The general's eyes widened in sudden realization, but it was too late. The bomb detonated in a blinding flash, the shockwave hurling Paul across the chamber. He slammed into the deck, his ears ringing, his vision swimming. Through the haze of pain and concussion he saw Zarak stagger and fall, his body consumed by the ravenous antimatter. "Paul!" Walker's shout cut through the chaos. "We have to go now!" Paul stumbled to his feet, his heart wrenching as he saw May's lifeless body cradled in Walker's arms. The chamber shuddered around them, consoles exploding in showers of sparks, the doomsday device thrashing in its restraints. "Go," Paul rasped, his voice thick with pain and grief. "Get to the shuttle. I'll be right behind you." Walker hesitated, anguish etched in the lines of his face. But he knew as well as Paul that there was no choice. With a final, agonized look, he turned and ran, May's body clutched to his chest. Paul staggered after him, the deck pitching and heaving beneath his feet. Bulkheads buckled, conduits ruptured, the air filling with acrid smoke. He reached the hangar bay just as the shuttle lifted off, Walker at the controls. Paul leapt for the closing ramp, his fingers scrabbling for purchase. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought he would miss, that he would be left behind to die with the dreadnought. But a hand closed around his wrist, hauling him aboard. Paul collapsed onto the deck, gasping for breath as the shuttle tore out of the hangar and into the void. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.